Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Winners, Wallets, and Worldviews podcast. I'm your host, AJ Armstrong. You can go to my website, aaronjarmstrong.com, or you can always follow along with me and my journey on Instagram. You are listening to Winners, Wallets, and Worldviews. Winners, we bring in guests from all over that are leaders, business leaders, thought leaders in different walks of life that are totally crushing it. Wallets, we talk about personal finance, real estate, and money. And finally, worldviews. We want to get to the bottom driving philosophies and values that a lot of these incredible people that really are world changers and rock stars out there have. So today's episode came from a live podcast-a-thon that I was invited to in our area. And I had a unique message that I delivered to everybody because I see a lot of conflicting advice in the world. And there's kind of two sides to it. There's people that say, you got to quit your job to be an entrepreneur and go out there and do your thing and focus and put all your energy and all your eggs in one basket. But then if I've studied general themes from a lot of successful people, there's ways of mitigating that risk. And I wanted to touch on my opinion of what the two sides of that look like of having a side hustle that builds into a career, or if you want to just dive feet first into a career. So we named this podcast When Not to Quit Your Job, because I think that advice is very relevant to people, especially this is when you decide you want to take the big leap, or you're thinking about taking the big leap, or maybe it's not right to take the big leap. And I think that there's custom scenarios for everybody. So it's a little bit different message. It was a little bit of a shorter podcast. And then we also had a Q&A where people ask questions afterwards. But it was a live event, and I'm really excited to share this with you guys. So without any further ado, welcome to the show.
Welcome to Winners, Wallets, and Worldviews, the only show that's going to teach you how to be somebody.
Where in your life did you learn that you're not good enough?
Take what you're most passionate about and what you're most fearful of, and what is the plan to overcome that fear, and what is the plan to enact that passion.
Aaron Armstrong, leader, engineer, entrepreneur, manager, veteran, investor, international business and life strategist, and author. Is that all of it? Speaker. Where's speaker? You do that too, right? And he's a speaker. Apparently he doesn't like to talk about that. Former D1 football player and graduate from the United States Military Academy at West Point with a Bachelor of Science in Systems Engineering. He and his wife are the owners and founders of 3 startup companies: Armstrong Ventures LLC, Armstrong Real Estate Group LLC, and Marissa's Fit Boutique LLC. And of course, the host of Winners, Wallets, and World Views. Aaron, come on up.
I'm being presidential tonight with the podium. Look at this. So I never write out a speech in my life because I can't read. I'm intellectually shallow that way. So here's the thing, guys. When I started as an entrepreneur, there was like so much conflicting advice I would get from people a lot. And this was where I started to realize there are multiple angles to view the world. And that's where I started to make that my interest or my hobby, was to kind of dissect this. And it's funny because Aristotle talks about something I mentioned in a lot of different speeches called the virtue of the mean. And what that is a virtue finds itself between two polarizing ends. You could look at the idea of courage. On one side, something could be rash. On the other side, something could be cowardice. And the virtue is in the middle, called courage. Now, I preface with this idea because I get a question a lot that's called when to quit your job. And that's a big question. And you get a lot of great insight and you get a lot of terrible insight in this. And I come from a philosophy that I've recently started to bring up more, and it's this idea of when the market zigs, you zag. And I hear a lot of social media personalities talking in this zigging direction when it comes to advice around when to quit your job. So I'm going to provide a little bit of advice, maybe in the other direction. And I do this from this position. Ray Dalio is a billionaire hedge fund manager who wrote the book called Principles. And he says when he makes big decisions, there's 2 things he looks at. Number 1 is my intuition, and the second is logic. And when these things align, you go. When these things are not aligned, you wait. And when they both go the other direction, you stop and you go somewhere else. So let me talk from a logical standpoint first. And that's why I wrote this down, is because I've got a lot of people that follow me or listen to me that are entrepreneurs, that want to quit their jobs, that want to go through this process. I want to be very careful how I worded it, because it can be very interesting to break this apart. So here we go. In this misled current age, we look at the world around the idea of financial goals, and we seem to have this preconceived notion that a successful business person looks a certain way. And this is largely credited to our self-help gurus, motivational personalities, or perhaps some relatable biography you may have read. And this statement might go against a lot of the popular point of views you might be listening to, from Gary Vee to Tim Ferriss to Tony Robbins. In my opinion, quite frankly, is to stop glorifying this idea of entrepreneurship itself. Now listen very carefully. The idea of entrepreneurship itself. Now before you jump at me, here's what I'm talking about. In the last 5 years, social media, the millennial generation, Gen Z, has provoked a compelling narrative that asserts that the path to success and personal freedom is literally rooted in the fact that you have to be an entrepreneur. Now, this advice is saying quit your job and follow your passions, I believe to be incomplete. And it's saturated the ears of podcast listeners and motivational speeches. And I am guilty of this. Okay, I've given advice like this, and I was talking to Caleb earlier about this, about how sometimes you look back at your old advice and you say, let's revise this and correct it. Now here, let's clarify this for 1 second. The goal here is success and to find personal freedom. Okay? That's usually what people are looking at when they're looking at why they're starting a business or why they have these ambitions that they're climbing for. And this business culture has elicited a false dichotomy between entrepreneurship and a corporate career path. People believe that corporate career paths mean you're a sheep, you're unwoke, you lack a better term for something else, right? That you're just kind of following this path that your parents set for you. Now, entrepreneurship's glorified for several reasons. It replicates this beauty of the objectivist philosophy, the classic American dream, the virtues such as fortitude and self-reliance. Now, this belief is popularized because we read stories and biographies of men and women who strayed away from the path of conformity and instead broke new grounds in the world of innovation. Now, being an entrepreneur is not contingent on nonconformity and vice versa. Hence, the false dichotomy unfolds. Now, what this means, in other words, is we should stop looking at the corporate versus entrepreneur dichotomy as us, students of business, and instead look at what does it mean to be a good business person versus a poor business person. And I'm going to give you 2 examples here. Here's the first one. A few weeks ago, I was speaking at a real estate seminar, and I was discussing this with a business owner who was a house flipper. So you guys are familiar with house flipping. It's when you buy a home and needs improvements, you selectively decide to invest into certain aspects of the home to increase its value, and then you sell it off for a higher price. This is done on HGTV, and this man's done dozens, maybe hundreds of house flips. He's very successful at it. And a lot of them make tens of thousands of dollars. So naturally, I was quite impressed. And he's spoken on stages, he's consulted with business owners, he's been featured all over the place as an authority figure in the entrepreneurship world. And I'm talking to him, and I'm kind of in awe of what he's telling me. And then he says, but listen, AJ, the thing is, when I broke down how much money I made per hour, it only came out to about $30 an hour. I'm like, okay, $30 an hour is not bad, but certainly it wasn't as impressive as I thought when I looked at him and thought of who he was. So I stepped back. This is like $60,000 a year, something like that. And I started to think about, you could get a job for $60,000 a year, assume much less liability, much less risk, and insert much less energy than to flip homes. And I left the speech that day kind of thinking about this. So everyone at this point is like, what is going on? This entrepreneur, AJ, is talking about this other entrepreneur who's only making $30 an hour. It's like, yeah, this is what I want to talk about. Listen to the second example now. In contrast, a few months prior to this conversation, I was talking to a different real estate investor This guy had a different strategy. He worked as a full-time civil engineer. He made $120,000 a year. He lived off of $60,000 a year, and he invested the rest of that $60,000 a year into one big real estate deal where he was a passive investor. And these are called limited partnership deals, where you invest money, the other guy does all the work, and he sees about an 18 to 22% return on this. Now, you can do this with multifamilies, you can do it with flips, you can do all sorts of different things. But he still got to enjoy a lot of the benefits, paid time off, the medical benefits, a consistent salary, a paycheck. And this guy was trying to get on podcasts to share this strategy. And he was telling me about how difficult it was for him to get picked up to go on podcasts in the entrepreneurship investment space because he's not an entrepreneur. He has a full-time job. And now, this is what I think is interesting, because no one wanted to hear him because he wasn't an entrepreneur. Now, let's contrast the two of these men for just one moment. One enjoys the idea of entrepreneurship, the other does not. However, they have equal incomes and very different qualities of living. Okay, so you're probably thinking, AJ, you run this podcast that's aimed at entrepreneurs, and now you're crapping on entrepreneurs. What gives, man? Well, here's what I'm saying. We need to remove the idea of associating value with the statement, I am an entrepreneur. It's irrelevant if you are or are not an entrepreneur. And for some of you that don't understand this problem, go take a look at people on social media, on Instagram, that put these labels out there, but they are not really doing anything. So here's the discussion. The goal is to be not a great entrepreneur or a great corporate employee, but perhaps a great business person, period. So it begs the question, what do successful business people do? And this is applicable to anybody in any situation. And there's 4 steps. Step 1. What successful people do is they find asymmetric risk versus reward. So I've spent the last probably 10 to 12 years studying the habits of highly successful individuals. Most of the guests on my podcast, winners, wallets, and worldviews. Winners, we're trying to bring people that have crushed it somewhere in life. Wallets, we're talking about money, personal finance, real estate. Worldviews, we're talking about what is their central values that guide them in the world. And I sometimes like to have some challenges with them as being a man of a Christian faith. Now, you study these people, and they're not necessarily entrepreneurs per se. Rather, they're brilliant at finding scenarios that have positive asymmetric risk versus reward. Okay, so this means that all the decisions that they decide to make with their resources, time, money, energy, they find the potential upside to be significantly greater than any type of risk that they find. And if it's a remarkably high upside and very little downside, the logical conclusion is to go forward. Now, a word of caution here is just because you label yourself as an entrepreneur doesn't mean you're automatically entitled to an unlimited ceiling of success. And that's what we're going to talk about in this second option, which is, we'll talk about that in a second. So this view of decisions can shed light onto the decision of when I should quit my job or when I should stay. It's when does the asymmetric risk versus reward significantly higher and positive, when there's only upside and virtually no downside. And every decision should be made this way according to the study of successful people. In fact, this is Ray Dalio's advice when he manages hedge funds. Now, step 2. Does the potential scenario have a highly clear path to scalability? So I have another friend, and he quit his day job to follow the beautiful lights of entrepreneurship. And he didn't necessarily do this because he was passionate about it. Rather, he did this to pursue financial freedom. So some people do things because they're passionate about it. Some people do things because they think it'll make more money. He was in the camp of doing it to make more money. And he decided he was going to help his wife, who makes high-end soaps, and they profit about $1.50 on each bar of soap that they make. It takes about 15 minutes per bar of soap, so the math comes out to be about $6 an hour. And not to insult anyone, but that's below minimum wage. So fortunately, they hustle. They work 80 to 100 hours a week, and they supplement their income with other activities. But you obviously get the point that they're hustling in a circle. They're hustling to scrape pennies together. They're hustling for really no serious goal. And that's the idea. There's no scalability in this plan. This path is not scalable because they've decided to work harder and not smarter. And that kind of leads me to the third point here. Find the opportunity with the biggest bang for your buck. And what I mean by the biggest bang for your buck is how much time and energy are you going to invest and what's the highest return you could possibly get for the least amount of time and energy you can invest. I always talk about optimizing time, energy, money on my podcast. I think those are the three resources, and I've actually mathematically proven that they are all correlated. If you wanted to see the proof on that, hit me up after. It's a really good time. That's what I call the three resources of life. And a great real estate investor told me, always take the path of least resistance. And me as a young hustler, ready to put his nose to the grindstone, I said, that doesn't sit well with me, man. I hustle. And he looked at me and he's like, okay, well, go ahead and hustle, man. But here's the thing. You want to look at getting the highest possible returns expected for the least amount of energy and time. Remember our soap maker friends. They worked much harder. Working smarter is usually better. So get efficient with the work. Make these decisions to quit. This guy made a decision to quit $80,000 job a year to start making a soap business that cranks in a whopping $24,000 a year, and that's not a solid plan. But here's the thing, AJ. What about the potential of that soap company? They're an entrepreneur. They have unlimited upside. What if they just stick with it? Yes, okay. If there's a path to scalability, that's point two. They can go the distance. They can invest in a manufacturing soap like machine that just cranks them out, and they can minimize their costs. But the fact of the matter is it's not a smart decision to do these types of things. So here's the fourth point. We got to blur the lines between the idea of what it means to be corporate and what it means to be an entrepreneur. So I talked about this a little bit before, but the impact that we need to start to put our pride aside and do what's best for us, because we as businesses, we are people, and we are businesses at our core value. And you say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have a business. It's like, yeah, you don't think you have a business, but you're worth a certain amount. Your skills can be used for certain things worth a certain amount. You can apply those in a corporate setting or in the open market for a certain amount. And the fact is, this is how a lot of business is done. And I think that's how we got to look at it. It's not that you just start a business to go do it. It's you look at your skills and what's the highest possible value you can get for that skill. And where can that be done? If that's done under the umbrella of a corporate parent, that's fine. If that's done in the open market, even better. That's what we got to look at. So I struggled for a while. And a friend of mine, he quits his 9-to-5 job as an entrepreneur. He struggled at it for a while, and then he started to find a business owner who was looking for a specific role to fit the description. So this is an example. He found this business owner who offered him a job for $120,000 a year, and instead of taking that job, he said, no, how about you just 1099 that job to me? I'll be an independent contractor for you. In this case, he was able to reconcile the pride of being an entrepreneur, but he's still working a 9-to-5. He still could get fired. He could still have to clock in, but now he has the pride of saying he's a business owner, but it's virtually the same scenario. And that's what I mean. The line is blurred. So if we can stop looking at the glory of either of those, but instead look at the value you can contribute to the marketplace with these specific skills, it can be a much more logical conclusion. So let's just summarize this very briefly. The first one, positive, asymmetric risk versus reward. Step 2, clear path to scalability. Step 3, the most amount of cash for the least amount of energy and time. And step 4, be a great business person and remove the idea that there's a corporate and entrepreneurship dichotomy. So what I say is, when you're looking at this discussion of when to quit your job, oftentimes you hear the advice as follow your heart. That's half of it. Remember Ray Dalio, use logic. This is the logical process, the 4 steps I just laid out. Now, what is the emotional side? What is the intuitive side? What is your soul and your spirit calling you to do? And I think there is an obligation to make a play in the direction of your calling. But we got to make sure that these things are aligning to some level. I mean, you look at the story of Jonah in the Bible, where he is feeling called to go in a certain way and continues to not answer the call and ends up in the belly of the whale. And these are the things that happen to us in life if we continue to ignore the call. But I have a belief that when these two things align, the logic of the scenarios and the results in front of you, and then the intuitive side of your soul and your spirit telling you to go in a direction, I say go as fast as you possibly can when those two things align. So ladies and gentlemen, that's what I want everyone to think about. When it comes to quitting your job, doing something else, retiring, graduating, leaving the military, I don't care where you're going, but make sure that the logic, the intuition align, and when they do, you don't go any slower You just go as fast as you possibly can until your feet continue to bleed. That's how fast I want you guys running. So without further ado, folks, you can always listen to the podcast with motivational content from this Appleton Co-op. You can go to Winners, Wallets, and Worldviews on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, all the hosting platforms. You can go to aaronjarmstrong.com to follow along. If you want to be a guest, you know a guest that I want to interview, dissect. They might be a winner. They might have a big wallet, or they got a great worldview. I'd love to have them on the show and discuss. But without any further ado, guys, thank you so much, Appleton Podcast Co-op, and give a huge hand for Caleb for his first awesome kick-ass freaking podcast live. Everybody, thank you so much.
All right, well, I get to play with the slips of paper and hold the microphone. That's exciting stuff. All right, so we're just going to kind of ask these questions at random, and I guess we're going to let whoever wants to answer it, or both of you answer it, because it's more fun that way. All right, now rather than fiddle with these, I'm just going to pull the one from the top here. What if I want to start a business but don't have enough money? Oh, I think I asked that one.
Start with that one. I think it's going to go back to what I was talking about with that what side is a lot more expensive than the who side. And a great thing to do is start on that who side. You can really focus with just understanding that problem, understanding the pain points, understanding your customer. That's not really going to cost you a whole lot of money. But at some point, you're going to have to reach that what side. And I think it's going to come down to something that I like to call thinking small. So when you start a business, kind of how Aaron was talking about, there's this entrepreneurship glorification of thinking as big as possible. And I don't have anything wrong with that. I think that we need to have goals that are set higher than we think we can achieve and our peers and our family members think we can achieve. That's really important to actually achieving big things like that. But I think setting a big goal like that can be kind of destructive for how we start our business. And so when I say think small, I say start with what's called an MVP. This is your minimum viable product. Something that carries the value out, that is your what, that carries the value out for your customer, but still remains as inexpensive as possible. So I'll give you an example. I had somebody on the show. This was actually the second person, one of the second interviews that I had on the show, Andrew Schmitz. He's got a company called the Proceed app, and it essentially removes the need for training manuals at different companies. So for example, if I'm at a mechanic and the boss is trying to teach an employee how to, change a tire, something simple like that, there's going to be a training manual to show you how to do that. And as many people realize nowadays, a lot of us are visual learners, and people learn a lot better through videos. So he created this app where you could record changing a tire, and essentially you would learn off your phone, okay, how do I do that, instead of reading through these papers. So this guy had no tech experience whatsoever, no experience with designing apps or building apps, but he knew he had this vision of where he wanted to go. And so he started his business, literally created wealth, made money with this business using Snapchat. So if you know what that is, it's just simply a recording app where you record a video and you can send it to different people. And so he started this business doing that. So he would bring this to businesses, make this video of changing a tire, and then from there, he created wealth. So create your MVP, start growing wealth from there, and that's when he started working with a developer to build this app. There's so many examples. I talk to people specifically. I get people on the episode specifically that have done this exact same thing. MVP is so important for when you're starting a business, and it answers that excuse of, I don't have enough money to start a business.
That's a great question. So the question was, if you don't have enough money to start a business, what do you do? I think there's a lot of good ways to approach this, and you touched on a bunch of them. Now, here's, I guess, what my advice would be was, this is a problem that comes up a lot in real estate, is when you are the guy, there's kind of two types of people. There's a person that does all the work, and there's the person that can finance it. And if you can look at these scenarios, which I want to be the person that does all the work, you can find somebody that wants to finance it. Now, that person that does all the work is responsible for something that's called a pro forma a lot of times. And this is some kind of financial proof or projection of your financials. And those have to be pretty bullet tight and objective. And in real estate, that's a pretty easy, I should say easy, it's a well-known business that's typically very certain when you can make projections in certain market conditions, I should say. But if you're doing a more speculative business venture, you're also welcome to look into something like a venture capitalist that thinks that they can see a path to profitability. So the burden on you, if you're seeking finances from somebody else, is to find out, how can I prove that this will get them a return? And if I can prove that it can get them a return, finding the money is typically not that hard. It comes with networking with high net worth individuals. I talk about this a lot with my podcast called Networking to the Next Level, is finding some people that you can kind of, be in your immediate circle of friends that have net worth they can provide. But what they're going to want to see is, hey, prove to me that I'm going to get my ROI. And if you can persuade them, you have no problem finding money. The second idea it would be to look at the market condition and do it kind of like the snowball effect. How can I just make this business a little bit of money that can start to pay itself off, and then I can reinvest the retained earnings into continuous improvements in the company, and it can just snowball from there. So this is kind of what I did with like my podcast, is like I just wanted to get to the point where it could start to make money off of some of the equipment, the hosting software, and just like ultra micro look at it. So that would be my advice for somebody looking to do it with no money. Number one, you could find a joint venture, you could find a partner. You could look at it that way and kind of go in with the assumption of I do all the work, you just give me the money, and I'll prove I can make that back for you. Or you could look at the snowball effect. What can I do for just sweat equity that'll improve the value, and I can start to make money, and it'll go from there. Oh man, that could be a loaded question. So it kind of depends. People are naturally, well, as a business owner and as a person, you want to look at what's in it for you, and you want to look at the other person, what's in it for them, as any good negotiation. So you want to figure out, what can I bring to the table, what can they bring to the table. Now, there is, I'd say, an implied task of trying to figure out the personality characteristics of a potential partner. So there's I could have talked about this earlier, but we did a Myers-Briggs, and it's one of the more watered-down personality tests, in my opinion, but it does show people you pair well with and people that you might butt heads with. And almost any partnership, you're going to butt heads to a certain level, so the more you can minimize that, the better. So just kind of looking at complementary personalities. The advice I always received on this was looking simply at introvert versus extrovert, and just to overly simplify it, usually introverts are totally a generalization, but usually they're more hands-on and they prefer to be more detail-oriented, and typically extroverts might be more into like the networking and the marketing and the creative side of it. So it's just kind of you can look at it that way, but that would be kind of my advice, is figure out who do you mesh with, and then also what do you bring to the table, and what does that person bring to the table, and does it seem weighted equally? Do you have anything on that?
Yeah. I would say one of the biggest things is vision. Make sure that if you are starting this company yourself, that you set that vision. What I mean by that is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you see this company in 5 years? And that should be a fairly easy question generally to answer, and those answers need to align somewhat. So for myself and my business partners for Fixed Picks, a venture that I'm working on, my co-founders that I work with, we all have the idea that we want to sell and exit this business in 3 to 5 years. That's generally our plan. Now, we might have different ways that we want to get to that end goal, but we all have that end goal, and we all keep in mind how to do that. I think another important part is how big or how big do you want this thing? So if this is just a soap company that's going to be a mom and pop store, you're not going to put nearly as much money in as if you're planning to make this a worldwide thing. You're going to pump a lot of money in to get a machine, to get things like that. So you have to kind of decide, how big do you want this thing? And based on how big it is, that's going to require less or more money. Finally, I think another thing is, and this kind of goes to the point of, also the point of, when should I bring on a partner? Because this is really important too. You don't want to bring on a partner too early and you guys just not really have enough work to do. And you don't want to bring on one too late where you're just overloaded with things that you don't even know how to do. So it's really important to recognize, be self-aware of what you're good at, what you're not good at, also what you like to do, what you don't like to do. And when you're starting out, you're going to a lot of times need to do things that you don't like to do. But once you get going and you start realizing, I don't have enough time to carry out all these tasks, that's when I bring somebody else in. And they're going to do the tasks that you don't like to do. So for example, my co-founder, he's a tech guy. He does all the coding, all the back end, all the app design. I don't know how to do any of that stuff. I know how to do the business stuff. He doesn't like doing the business stuff. He came to me and specifically said, I like all the coding, all this stuff. I don't like to do the business stuff. You handle this. So we base off of each other's strengths and weaknesses. I don't know how to do that. I don't like doing that. He doesn't like doing what I do, and he's not good at it. And we get along tremendously because we have those opposites attract. It's kind of like that. So.
All right, thank you very much. And all right, I'm going to change this question a little bit, just a tiny little bit. Talking about challenges, specifically common challenges faced by entrepreneurs. So both of you being entrepreneurs, both of you having worked with other entrepreneurs, spoken with other entrepreneurs, what would each of you say is the top most common challenge faced by entrepreneurs you've interacted with?
So just because my podcast has to do with new entrepreneurs and starting out, I think the biggest problem that new entrepreneurs face is they're creating something that nobody wants. And this is the Chasm thing, going back to this, is they're so focused on the what, so focused on the thing that might help them out, but they haven't talked to that who. They haven't spoken with anybody on this side. And they take 2 years and spend thousands of dollars in grant money and build this thing, and they get over to the other side finally, and they realize that nobody wants this thing. So a common problem is people focus on this side way too much when they should, right off the bat, if I'm going into a venture, if I see a problem, what I should have done with One Swipe is I saw that problem, I should have gone right to that teacher and started speaking with him. Is this a problem for you? What are some of the biggest inefficiencies that you find in the classroom? Then I should have gone to the next classroom, the next one. I should have gotten on the phone right off the bat. I could have done that in a week's time and learned so much and probably spent 8 to 12 months designing this thing rather than 2 years.
Yeah, great. That's a good question, and I think to preface that question, there's, I think, a difference between the biggest problems and the most common problems, and there's also difference between the problems at different levels of entrepreneurship. So Caleb mentioned a couple that you get kind of early on, but then there's also like some you get late on, which is like getting out of your business and then going through the process of an exit. But there's tons of different problems that I see with people, and I think to Caleb's point, what he's getting at is very true. And I talked about this on your podcast, and that was that one of the most common things I see is people have an idea, but getting the idea into a thing or into motion takes a significant amount of energy and thought. And the tool that I've recommended, and I recommended on Caleb's podcast, if you want to listen to that, it's kind of a three-way Venn diagram where you look at your personal strengths, you look at what are you passionate about, what really fires you up, and you look about what is the market saying. And Caleb talked about that quite a bit today. It's not just about inventing something, like listening to the market and trying to bridge that chasm, if you will. And I think that's kind of what I've noticed most with people is they will do something they're either really good at because they're good at it and that feels good. They'll do something they're really passionate about, or they'll do something that just is for the money. And it's not an or, it's an and. You should look at all three of those things consistently to do. And I get incomplete advice all the time that says, hey, you should just, I'm investing into, I'll pick on, Bitcoin or something, and they're just doing it because it's making money. It's like, does that fire you up? Is that your calling? Are you being called to do that? And they say, well, I don't know about that. And it's like, well, you're following the money, brother. You're following the money. You're eventually going to be disappointed at some point in that journey. You'll be unsatisfied, and you'll be left empty and unfulfilled. So I would say the biggest problem is what Kayla's podcast talks about, which is that grounding from an idea to reality, and then being able to figure out the idea to continue to make your career path, if you will.
All right, that's great. And I'm a father of four, man. I'm all about following the money. Hell yeah. All right, so kind of tagging back into some of the guys you've interviewed, some of the entrepreneurs you've interviewed, talked to over the past, or even just met or networked with. What are some of the strangest or most interesting business ideas you've encountered? Like what's one that kind of sticks out in your mind that when somebody asks you about weird ideas, you think, well, that was a hell of a weird idea?
There's lots of weird ideas. I've found that there are ideas that are good independent that people want to combine. I'll give you an example. I had one client that was a woman who was a massage therapist. She was a nurse. She was a nutrition consultant. And what else was there? What's that? Oh, caretaker. A whole bunch of like things that just seemed like all over the place. And she calls me. She's like, hey, like she had certifications and like deep credentials on all of those things that I just mentioned. And we're kind of like, how do we pull this all together? So I guess the idea I came up with was like, well, what's like the most, kind of back to my statement before, like what's the biggest bang for your buck? Like you're a registered nurse. That's corporate-ish, right? That dichotomy, yeah. And it's like, well, how do we pull that into the brand? Well, we decided we're going to call her the natural nurse, and she uses massage therapy and nutrition consultation to provide natural insights into your overall health and well-being. And it's like, oh, that sounds fine that way. And it was like, I'm telling you, this was weeks of us trying to figure out like all these crazy different ideas or whatever, and how you could bring that into one business, and that was end up being the solution. So I think the ideas independent were good, but when you combined it into one, it was like, this isn't like a good idea at all, but kind of worked out, I guess.
This is my idea because I can't think of any other ones, but this is kind of interesting. So I think it was like my fourth or fifth episode. I was interviewing a woman by the name of Melissa Gaglione, and she created, her family is in the towing industry. And as you can imagine, it's like 98% guys, right? But there's that 2% where there are women in that tow trucks, by the way, towing industry. And so she noticed that the only clothing available for tow truck drivers and towing people was men's. So she would see women walking around in these pants that would like go down to their shoes and it'd just be baggy and everything. So she created Safety for Her, which is simply leggings, different clothing for women that just have strips of reflective material on it, and it took off. Her story, like obviously I'm going to oversimplify it so it's going to sound easy, but she just went to trade shows. There's apparently huge tow truck trade shows. There's trade shows for everything. And she simply wore these pants around, she displayed them, and people flocked to her. They just started flying off the shelves. So that's just a cool, interesting story, but it's a kind of a point to look at places in the market where you think, oh, that's oversaturated, right? There's plenty of people that make tow truck clothing. They obviously missed that 2%, and when the towing industry is, I have no idea, but probably millions of dollars, you scrape 2% off of that, that's still a good amount of money, so. Yeah.
I forgot to add this. I just thought of this as you were talking. I'll leave his name out of this because Chad knows him, but there was a guy that was, he came to me, he was looking for like a business loan, like some kind of like pure lending. I said, okay, well, what are you working on? And he's like, well, I want some woodworking equipment. And I said, okay, if you want some money, you're probably gonna have to show me like a business plan and exactly like what you're doing. And he's like, okay. So he's like, well, I'm making pipes. And I was just like, well, can I see the pipes? Like, what are these pipes you're making or whatever? And he's like, well, they're really elaborate pipes. I'm like, really elaborate pipes. What are you making, dude? And he's like, bongs. I'm making bongs to smoke marijuana. And I was just like, oh, okay. Well, thank you for at least letting me know. Like, I'm like, if you wanted to get And I'm like, what about the business plan? And then he's like, yeah, I don't know about that. And I was like, okay, man. Well, anyway, that was like, I think a funny one. But
I don't know about ROI, but all the Doritos you can eat, right? I'm assuming since these pants were made by a woman, they had pockets. Oh, God. And they're still useless. That's fantastic. I come from a lot of small towns, so we had combined businesses everywhere. My favorite actually worked at a movie store and bus stop. It was a small, small town. I'd go over here and rent some guy porn, and then I'd go over here and sell some guy a bus ticket to New York City. It was fantastic. All right. So, small towns. Woo! And I knew their names every time.
Ammunition and gun shop with the bar.
That's right. We have one of those in Wisconsin, I think. Beer, cheese, and ammo, yeah. Somebody showed me a picture. It's in like Racine or something. America. It's the most American Wisconsin thing ever.
came up from Jersey and they're like, we've never been to Wisconsin before. And then my uncle just looks at them, welcome to America.
That's right. That's all you need to say. Well, you're both podcasters. We're all podcasters. So why did you choose to deliver your message via podcast as opposed to any number of platforms? You know, I mean, blogging's dead. Everybody knows that. But other than that, why'd you choose podcasts?
How I started actually with podcasting was I was working on my other venture, Fixed Picks, and we needed a microphone so that we could record some training videos for that. And I got this microphone from Gabriel, and my little brother Gabriel, he used to do some YouTube videos, yeah. And we were making those videos, and I was like thinking, I listen to so many podcasts, and this is actually like my podcast started in May, but this has been brewing for like 2 years since I started One Swipe, because I talked to so many people at school and outside of school about, they would come to me and say, Caleb, I have this really cool idea, you know, how do I build this, how do I take it? So I decided after I got this mic, and I was like, Bing Lightbulb, why don't I use all these stories, all these things that I tell people, and put this in a recording platform where I can send it out to hundreds and thousands of people, and then have it come back 10 years later. That's the beautiful thing about podcasting. You can go back 10 years later and listen to stuff like that. So I thought this would be a great platform. Kind of think of it as like a tree branch, with like a dead tree branch, but you can stem a bunch of things, revenue streams or whatever off of it, like speaking events or a product. You can build, the podcast itself can build a personal brand, and it has. And from there you can stem, you know, you have your audience there, you can stem different products, things like that. So,
Man, that's a great question. Well, so when I guess part of my story was when I was getting involved in real estate, I had found some pretty good success early on, and I was telling my buddies from West Point stuff about this, and then they would call me, and somehow like they were telling each other, and then they were calling me, and my wife was like, dude, you've been on the phone every night for like the last couple months. Are you going to have a relationship? We just got married, you know, kind of thing. And I'm just like, well, I got to figure out a more efficient way to do these phone calls. So I was like, well, and I kind of took my own advice a little bit. I said, well, what's like the least amount of energy I have to put into something to get the most amount of listenership or participation? I was like, I think a podcast would be a great idea. And I was working with a coach that was like, I could just press record, I could get a system set up, and then I just invest an hour of my life into this when I'm doing a bazillion things. So I was like, that could be better than writing, because, you know, I'm illiterate. I just told you guys, I'm intellectually shallow. You know, it's just like, I'm an engineer, so like I always just joke and say that I'm illiterate because, you know, I write and I spell, and if I don't have spell check, it's going to be spelled wrong. So that's kind of how my scenario works. But anyway, so I got into this idea of broadcasting a lot of the common advice I would give to people as they were calling me. And the podcast, gathered some attention, and then people started inviting me to speak places. And that was really exciting because I thought that was something I was really passionate about, and I thought I was getting feedback that I was doing a decent job at it. So I started trying to do that more professionally, and that's kind of how that podcasting thing came about.
That's great. You were able to leverage the stuff that you knew and then turn that into a podcast. Yeah. See, I lost my, and then bring guests on for your journey. Yeah, that's absolutely, yeah. See, I was in radio, and I always said if I ever lost my job in radio, I have no other skills. And so then podcasting became a thing, and thank God. All right, last question, and it goes back to the business aspect of things a little bit. You guys both have some familiarity with investing and being able to grow investments and things like that. The questioner, and I don't know who it is because they're all anonymous, the questioner says, my son wants to get into investing. What do I tell him? So let's say this. What is because there's probably like a book's worth of crap you should probably tell somebody who wants to invest. So what's the first thing they should tell him?
You're more in the investment space, but I was going to say, like, starting out, I think the first thing you need to invest in is your mind, your knowledge, your skills. Because if you start dumping money into actual investments, real estate, stocks, a business, and you don't have anything going on up here, that's going to flop. So you need to put some time, some money, some energy in your skills, what you have, so that when you do hit the ground running, then it goes up. This can often be a problem because you go in like wanting to invest right off the bat, and you're like, oh, I actually have to like learn this now? I'm using this money that I could have invested. But the thing is that these skills that you learn are going to stay with you for the rest of your life, and you can compound them. Whereas this investment, who knows where that's going to go. So I think that's a good preface into what you're going to say.
Man, how do I follow that? What brilliant advice. Such an old soul, So wise, Caleb. Yeah, so wise, man.
That's who I have on the podcast, old souls.
So I think that's great advice because that was kind of half the advice that I got when I was like, I knew I wanted to do cool stuff someday. But when I was like 18 and I was at the West Point prep school because my ACT score wasn't high enough to get into West Point directly, so they put all the football players at the prep school to get their ACT scores higher, and then they decided to let us into the academy a year later. So I'm on the hashtag 5-year plan at West Point, but So when I was at the prep school though, it was cool is you were actually enlisted, so you got like enlisted money in the Army. And I remember it was an hour south of New York City in New Jersey, hashtag Marissa's country, and all my buddies on the weekends were going up to New York City and like getting like bottle service at clubs and like just all this crazy stuff. And I was just like totally trying to find myself in the world of like being social and stuff. And I was like, I'm just going to sit in my room, read, and figure out what to do. And I started to just like stack up all this stipend money. So I called my dad and I'm like, hey, what do I do to kind of like, with all this cash I'm just sitting on it. And he's like, well, let's sit down with my financial advisor. And that's kind of where it started for me. So I guess the advice I would give is to start as early as possible, like as early as possible. The day you decide you want to start investing for the future is when the day you should start investing. And I think that was the advice, like somebody's son in high school. I know the woman that asked this question, like that's just exactly start now. Start getting a job, putting some aside, investing it into certain conservative funds, and then as you kind of like grow into yourself, you could decide where you want to place that cash. And fortunately for us, we were in a great financial position when I graduated from Marissa and I, we got married because we were able to put all that aside and start to grow that. And then I got into like day trading for a while, and that's another story. I don't condone that anymore. And I also don't condone online poker. So my advice is start early. Time value of money, it will pay off immensely. You start at 16 years old, you could easily be a millionaire by the time you're 26. So that's just the advice I would give everybody.
One more quick one. I think it's really important starting young, and I don't know if you said this or not, but I'm going to flip it a little bit. And I would say start risky when you're young because you have all this time to actually try new things and to learn new things. So going back to like learning is an incredibly important thing to do to invest your money into. And I would say be a little risky because you have all this time in your life to do this. And if you can really latch onto something that you're good at, I think it's worth the risk. last little bit.
All right, I didn't realize how risky this question was going to be when I asked it. We were, 2 years from you answering with online poker. Your son wants to invest online poker.
But before you got to learn it.
Yeah, can't miss. All right, well, we're going to wrap this up then. One more question from the gallery. Yes, sir. From the gallery. Gallery.
That was a lot of words. he's asking, essentially, is the first step the hardest step to take? So there's the crossing the chasm is something extremely difficult. Scaling the business, very difficult, and exiting the business. I've never exited a business. I've somewhat scaled a business, but probably nothing to the extent that you have. So I don't know if I'm going to be super helpful with this question. Take a stab at it. I think that it never becomes easy, but your resiliency increases. And I found this myself. I have learned in the 4 months from starting podcasting and going off on my own and working with Fixed Picks, I have learned more in terms of business than I have in my whole life. It's just this densely packed 4 months of just this insane learning, and along with that, insane resiliency. And so I believe that when you start out, you are very emotional, I guess you could say, or somebody turned me down, or my who didn't like my idea, so I'm going to go sulk. But when you cross that chasm, when you do that first step, that can be extremely difficult, but it builds up that resiliency. And so you could say, yeah, maybe scaling is more difficult, but your resiliency, that callus that you start building up, is stronger, and you'll be able to do it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think someone gave me this advice. My wife and I are thinking about maybe possibly having children at some point. We're thinking, she's way more into it. We're thinking about it. We've gotten to the thinking part now. So, and I was talking to one of my buddies who plays with me in the band at church. I'm like, hey man, you just had a kid. What's it like? And he's like, well, things start to just suck differently. He's like, the first year sucks because they're crying all the time. The second year sucks, so they're not really crying all the time. Now they're just having temper tantrums. He's like, and then the third year sucks because now you got to figure out how to get them to school and then split time with grandparents, and they can talk to you and get into things. And he's like, but all the old things that suck kind of went away. And I was like, that's exactly what it's like, I think, in a business. It's it just continues to just suck differently. And it's the first part is getting yourself to take I'm going to do this. Let's go. And it takes this mindset transformation. And it's okay, now I got the mindset. And it's now I have no knowledge or skills to do this. And it's I got to figure all this out. So then you get to this scalability part, and you're I got to learn real skills to figure out how to do all this stuff. And I found that, yeah, scaling kind of sucks because it just sucks differently where you can just hire employees as you grow and stuff, and then you have employees that don't show up, or they show up at the wrong time, or they rob you with their money. These are all true stories that have happened to me. So you kind of run into these situations, or they just start working poorly and you didn't have the right agreement in place. So scaling isn't necessarily obvious either. And I have one comment on an exit. So I usually, my philosophy on an exit is to not go into a business with the intention and plan of exiting per se. The exit should only be necessary if you have a totally change of heart or a change of calling or something like that. But people that get into a business saying yeah, we're going to code this app, and then we're going to sell it in 5 years to Facebook, and we're going to just pop smoke, and we're going to live at large in San Diego. It's I don't think that's necessarily a good strategy to go in, because I don't think you're following something that you're truly passionate and called to do. I think if you're following something that's truly passionate and you're called to do, you'll stick with that, and then the exit comes in retirement. You can hand it down generationally, or you can, if you have tangible assets within your business and you've operated it, you can actually sell that to somebody and you can evaluate it accordingly. So I haven't exited any businesses, but that's my view on it. I just I'm with this podcast till podcasts. I can't podcast any longer. It's just like I'm in the Armstrong Ventures is going to continue to be my umbrella for my stupid business ideas that are going to just sit underneath there. That business will be open until I make no more money or until I die. So that's just kind of my philosophy going into it. It's like, I'm going to stick with this baby. But some people go into it. They're like, I want to have an exit strategy. I can't talk to that. I just think, with your passion, what you're called to do, like finish what you start. That's kind of you could later in the game, like let's say, okay, I'm ready to get out. I didn't plan this from the beginning, but I want to sell this in 5 years. There's a prep you can do for that business, whatever it is, to condition it to be ready. So for example, I like to qualify a lot of my expenses for tax deductions. I would probably not do as many qualifications if I was thinking of selling, because I'd want to see the profit as high as possible. But now I'm looking at seeing the profit as low as possible because I don't want to get taxed on it. But so like that situation happened to a business owner that was on the corner of G and 76, the Beehive. So what was going on with them was the city bought their property on eminent domain to make a roundabout, and the city just looked at their taxes, and they were just like, this is the valuation of your property that we're going to give you. They're like, wait, whoa, it's not really that. And it's like backfired, right? So like, moral of the story is be honest with your taxes.
and online poker.
All right, David, was there anything you wanted to say about Appleton Podcast Co-op before we wrap up?